Depression is closely tied to disruptions in the brain's chemistry, particularly in systems that regulate motivation, reward, and mood. One of the central players in this process is dopamine, a neurotransmitter that is critical for driving goal-directed behavior and creating a sense of anticipation and reward. Under normal conditions, dopamine is released when you pursue and achieve meaningful activities, reinforcing those behaviors and making them feel worthwhile. In depression, this system often becomes less responsive, meaning that the same activities no longer produce the same sense of reward or motivation. This reduction in dopamine signaling does not just affect how you feel after completing a task, it also impacts your willingness to initiate action in the first place. Tasks that once seemed simple can begin to feel overwhelming or not worth the effort. This leads to a decrease in engagement with daily activities, which further reduces opportunities for dopamine release. Over time, this creates a feedback loop where reduced activity leads to lower dopamine levels, and lower dopamine levels make it even harder to take action. Serotonin is another key neurotransmitter involved in depression, but its role is somewhat different. While dopamine is more closely tied to motivation and reward, serotonin is involved in mood regulation, emotional balance, and the overall sense of well-being. Disruptions in serotonin signaling can lead to increased sensitivity to negative experiences, difficulty regulating emotions, and a tendency toward persistent low mood. It also influences sleep, appetite, and other bodily functions that are often affected in depression. These chemical systems do not operate in isolation. They interact with broader brain networks that shape how experiences are processed. When dopamine and serotonin systems are dysregulated, the balance of activity across these networks shifts. Positive experiences may fail to register as strongly, while negative experiences can have a more pronounced impact. This imbalance contributes to the characteristic patterns of thinking seen in depression, where individuals may struggle to find pleasure or meaning, even in situations that would normally be rewarding. Another important aspect is how these neurotransmitter systems are influenced by behavior and environment. Factors such as chronic stress, lack of sleep, poor nutrition, and reduced physical activity can all disrupt dopamine and serotonin function. For example, chronic stress can blunt dopamine release and alter serotonin signaling, making it harder for the brain to maintain a stable and positive mood. Similarly, insufficient exposure to natural light can affect serotonin levels, which in turn influences mood and circadian rhythms. The brain's reward system is also highly sensitive to predictability and expectation. In depression, the ability to anticipate positive outcomes is often diminished. This means that even before engaging in an activity, the brain does not generate the same level of motivation or excitement. This lack of anticipation further reduces the likelihood of taking action, reinforcing the cycle of inactivity and low mood. Understanding depression through this lens highlights why it is not simply a matter of willpower or attitude. The underlying biology directly affects the capacity to feel motivated and experience reward. This also explains why small, structured behaviors, such as setting manageable goals or engaging in brief activities, can be effective. These actions can begin to stimulate dopamine release in a controlled way, gradually rebuilding the brain's ability to experience motivation and reward over time. A major feature of depression is the overactivity of brain networks involved in self-referential thinking, particularly the default mode network. This network is responsible for how you think about yourself, your past, and your future. Under normal conditions, it helps with reflection, planning, and making sense of experiences. However, in depression, this network can become overly dominant and less flexible, leading to persistent patterns of rumination and negative self-focus. Rumination is not simply thinking about problems. It is a repetitive and passive loop of thoughts that tend to circle around the same themes, often centered on regret, self-criticism, or perceived failures. These thought patterns are not easily interrupted because they are supported by well-established neural pathways. The more frequently these circuits are activated, the stronger they become, making the brain more likely to default to them automatically. In this state, the brain becomes biased toward internally generated information rather than external input. This means that even when the external environment provides neutral or positive signals, the brain may continue to interpret experiences through a negative internal lens. For example, a small mistake might be amplified into a broader belief about personal inadequacy, or a neutral social interaction might be interpreted as rejection. This bias reinforces the depressive state by continually feeding the same negative narratives. The interaction between the default mode network and other brain systems also becomes altered. Normally, networks involved in attention and executive control, such as those governed by the prefrontal cortex, help regulate and shift focus away from unhelpful thoughts. In depression, this regulatory control is often weakened, making it harder to disengage from rumination once it begins. As a result, thoughts become more persistent and less flexible, and the ability to redirect attention is reduced. Another important aspect is how these thought patterns influence emotional responses. The brain does not process thoughts and emotions separately. They are tightly linked. Repetitive negative thinking can continuously activate emotional circuits associated with sadness, anxiety, or hopelessness. Over time, this creates a reinforcing loop where negative thoughts trigger negative emotions, and those emotions, in turn, make negative thoughts more likely to occur. These patterns also affect how the brain predicts future outcomes. The brain constantly uses past experiences to generate expectations about what will happen next. In depression, these predictions become skewed toward negative outcomes, which can reduce motivation and increase avoidance behaviors. If the brain consistently expects failure or disappointment, it becomes less likely to initiate actions that could potentially lead to positive experiences. Importantly, this overactivity of negative thinking networks is not a conscious choice. It reflects a shift in how neural circuits are functioning and interacting. This is why simply trying to think positively is often ineffective, as the underlying system is biased toward maintaining these patterns. Interventions that target attention and awareness, such as mindfulness or cognitive restructuring, can help by gradually strengthening the brain's ability to observe and disengage from these loops. By repeatedly shifting attention away from rumination and toward external or neutral stimuli, it is possible to weaken these circuits over time and restore a more balanced pattern of brain activity. Chronic stress is one of the most powerful drivers of depression because it directly alters the brain's structure, chemistry, and ability to regulate emotions. When the body is exposed to stress, it activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, leading to the release of cortisol, a hormone that helps mobilize energy and prepare the body to deal with challenges. In short bursts, this system is highly adaptive, but when stress becomes prolonged, the constant elevation of cortisol begins to have negative effects on the brain. One of the primary regions affected is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making, planning, and regulating emotional responses. High levels of cortisol over time can reduce the efficiency of this area, making it harder to think clearly, control impulses, and shift perspective. This contributes to the feeling of being mentally stuck, where it becomes difficult to move away from negative thoughts or consider alternative viewpoints. The hippocampus, a region critical for memory and learning, is also highly sensitive to chronic stress. Elevated cortisol can impair its function and even reduce its volume over time. This affects the ability to form new memories and contextualize experiences properly. In the context of depression, this can lead to a bias toward recalling negative experiences more easily than positive ones, reinforcing a pessimistic outlook and making it harder to update beliefs based on new information. At the same time, stress tends to increase activity in the amygdala, a region involved in detecting threats and generating emotional responses such as fear and anxiety. When the amygdala becomes more active, the brain becomes more sensitive to perceived threats, even in situations that are not objectively dangerous. This heightened reactivity can make everyday challenges feel overwhelming and contribute to a constant sense of unease or tension. These changes create an imbalance in how different brain regions interact. The prefrontal cortex becomes less effective at regulating the amygdala, while the hippocampus becomes less able to provide context and perspective. As a result, emotional responses become stronger and less controlled, and negative interpretations of events become more automatic. Chronic stress also affects neurotransmitter systems, including dopamine and serotonin. Prolonged exposure to stress can reduce dopamine signaling, leading to decreased motivation and reward sensitivity, while also disrupting serotonin balance, which affects mood and emotional stability. These chemical changes further reinforce the cognitive and emotional patterns associated with depression. Another important factor is how stress impacts the body's rhythms, particularly sleep. Elevated cortisol levels can interfere with the natural sleep-wake cycle, making it harder to fall asleep or stay asleep. Poor sleep, in turn, further disrupts brain function, reducing the ability to regulate emotions and process experiences effectively. This creates a cycle where stress impairs sleep, and poor sleep increases vulnerability to stress. Over time, the brain begins to adapt to this high-stress environment, making these patterns more ingrained. What starts as a response to external pressure can become a persistent internal state, even when the original stressors are no longer present. This is one of the reasons depression can continue even after stressful circumstances have changed. Lifestyle factors have a powerful and direct influence on depression because they regulate the basic biological systems that control mood, energy, and cognitive function. Sleep, physical activity, nutrition, and sunlight exposure are not just background variables. They actively shape how the brain operates at the level of neurotransmitters, hormones, and neural circuits. Sleep is one of the most critical components. During healthy sleep, especially deep and REM stages, the brain resets emotional circuits, consolidates memories, and regulates neurotransmitter systems like serotonin and dopamine. In depression, sleep is often disrupted, either through insomnia or excessive sleeping, and this disruption further destabilizes brain function. When sleep is insufficient or irregular, the prefrontal cortex becomes less effective at regulating emotional responses, while the amygdala becomes more reactive. This imbalance makes it easier for negative emotions to dominate and harder to maintain emotional stability. Sunlight exposure is another key factor because it directly influences circadian rhythms and serotonin levels. Light entering the eyes, particularly in the morning, signals the brain to regulate the release of hormones like cortisol and melatonin in a predictable pattern. This helps set the body's internal clock, which affects sleep, energy, and mood. Reduced exposure to natural light can lead to lower serotonin activity and disrupted circadian timing, both of which are associated with depressive symptoms. Even brief daily exposure to sunlight can help stabilize these systems. Physical activity has a strong effect on brain chemistry and structure. Exercise increases the release of dopamine and serotonin, improving mood and motivation. It also stimulates the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which supports the growth and maintenance of neural connections. This is particularly important in depression, where neural circuits can become less flexible. Regular movement helps restore some of that flexibility, making it easier for the brain to shift out of rigid patterns of thinking and behavior. Nutrition also plays a foundational role. The brain requires a steady supply of nutrients to produce neurotransmitters and maintain cellular function. Diets that lead to large fluctuations in blood sugar can result in unstable energy levels, which affect concentration and mood. Deficiencies in key nutrients, such as certain amino acids, omega-3 fatty acids, and vitamins, can impair the brain's ability to regulate emotions effectively. While nutrition alone is not a cure, it provides the biochemical support necessary for other interventions to work. These lifestyle factors interact with each other in important ways. Poor sleep can reduce the likelihood of engaging in physical activity, while lack of movement can negatively impact sleep quality. Limited sunlight exposure can disrupt circadian rhythms, which in turn affects both sleep and energy levels. This interconnected system means that small changes in one area can have ripple effects across others. Depression often pushes these systems in the wrong direction simultaneously, leading to less movement, poorer sleep, and reduced exposure to natural light. Reversing this does not require drastic changes at first. Even small, consistent adjustments can begin to shift the system. These changes work by gradually restoring balance to the biological processes that support stable mood and cognitive function, allowing the brain to operate in a more regulated and adaptive way. One of the most effective ways to counter depression is through behavior, even when motivation is extremely low, because action itself can begin to shift the underlying brain chemistry and neural circuits. Depression often creates a state where the brain reduces dopamine signaling, making it difficult to initiate tasks or feel a sense of reward. This leads to inactivity, which further decreases dopamine, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. The key insight is that waiting for motivation to appear before taking action usually does not work, because the biological systems that generate motivation are already suppressed. When you engage in even small, structured actions, you create opportunities for dopamine release. This does not require large or complex behaviors. Simple activities such as getting out of bed at a consistent time, taking a short walk, or completing a small task can begin to activate the brain's reward system. The effect may be subtle at first, but repeated engagement strengthens the neural circuits associated with motivation and reward, gradually making it easier to initiate and sustain activity. Consistency is more important than intensity in this process. Large, irregular efforts are less effective than small, repeated actions because the brain responds to patterns over time. When a behavior is performed consistently, it signals to the brain that this activity is relevant and worth reinforcing. This leads to gradual increases in dopamine signaling and improved efficiency in the neural pathways involved in initiating action. Structure also plays a critical role. Depression often disrupts the sense of time and reduces the ability to organize behavior. Creating a simple daily structure, even if it is minimal, helps stabilize the brain's rhythms. For example, setting fixed times for waking, eating, and engaging in basic activities provides external cues that guide behavior when internal motivation is lacking. These cues reduce the cognitive load required to make decisions and help maintain a baseline level of activity. Another important aspect is the use of effort-based reward. In a healthy system, dopamine is not only released when a reward is received, but also during the process of working toward a goal. In depression, this anticipatory component is often diminished. By deliberately engaging in tasks that require effort and recognizing the completion of those tasks, you begin to retrain the brain to associate effort with reward again. Over time, this can restore the ability to feel satisfaction from progress rather than just outcomes. Physical movement is particularly effective because it combines behavioral activation with physiological changes. Even low-intensity movement can increase blood flow, stimulate neurotransmitter release, and improve overall brain function. This creates a more favorable internal state for further action, making it easier to build momentum. Importantly, these actions do not need to feel enjoyable at the beginning. The goal is not immediate pleasure, but gradual recalibration of the brain's systems. As these systems begin to recover, the capacity for enjoyment and motivation often follows. This process can feel slow, but it reflects real changes in neural function rather than temporary mood shifts. Behavioral action works because it directly engages the systems that depression disrupts. By repeatedly activating these systems through small, manageable steps, it is possible to weaken the cycle of inactivity and gradually rebuild the brain's ability to generate motivation, reward, and sustained engagement. Social connection plays a critical role in regulating the brain systems involved in depression, and its absence can significantly worsen symptoms. Humans are biologically wired for interaction, and many of the neurotransmitters and hormones that influence mood are directly affected by social contact. When you engage with others in a meaningful way, the brain releases chemicals such as dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, all of which contribute to feelings of well-being, safety, and emotional balance. In depression, there is often a tendency to withdraw from social interaction. This withdrawal is not simply a behavioral choice. It is driven by changes in brain function that reduce motivation and increase sensitivity to perceived rejection or negative evaluation. However, this avoidance creates a feedback loop. The less social interaction occurs, the fewer opportunities the brain has to activate these positive neurochemical systems, which can deepen feelings of isolation and low mood. Oxytocin, in particular, is important because it is associated with trust, bonding, and a sense of connection. Even brief positive social interactions such as a conversation, a shared activity, or physical touch can increase oxytocin levels and reduce stress responses. This helps calm the nervous system and counteract the heightened activity in stress-related circuits that is often present in depression. Social interaction also provides external regulation of thought patterns. When left alone, especially in a depressive state, the brain is more likely to default to rumination and negative self-focused thinking. Interaction with others introduces new perspectives, feedback, and emotional cues that can interrupt these internal loops. This does not require deep or intense conversations. Even casual or routine interactions can help shift attention outward and reduce the dominance of negative thoughts. At the same time, structured support such as therapy can play a key role in reshaping the neural patterns associated with depression. Therapeutic approaches, including cognitive behavioral therapy, work by helping individuals identify and modify unhelpful thought patterns and behaviors. This engages the prefrontal cortex, strengthening its ability to regulate emotional responses and override automatic negative thinking. Over time, this leads to changes in how neural circuits are activated and connected. Medication can also be an important component for some individuals, particularly when the biological disruptions are severe. Antidepressant medications often target serotonin and other neurotransmitter systems, helping to stabilize mood and create a more favorable baseline for behavioral and cognitive interventions. While medication does not solve all aspects of depression, it can reduce the intensity of symptoms enough to allow other strategies to be more effective. Another important factor is consistency in social and therapeutic engagement. The brain changes through repeated activation of specific circuits, and regular interaction reinforces the pathways associated with connection, trust, and emotional regulation. Irregular or inconsistent engagement is less effective because it does not provide the repeated input needed to reshape these systems. Depression often narrows the focus inward and reduces interaction with the external world, but social connection and structured support act as counterforces. By reintroducing external input and engaging systems that regulate mood and stress, they help shift the brain away from isolation-driven patterns and toward more adaptive and balanced functioning. Social connection plays a critical role in regulating the brain systems involved in depression, and its absence can significantly worsen symptoms. Humans are biologically wired for interaction, and many of the neurotransmitters and hormones that influence mood are directly affected by social contact. When you engage with others in a meaningful way, the brain releases chemicals such as dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, all of which contribute to feelings of well-being, safety, and emotional balance. In depression, there is often a tendency to withdraw from social interaction. This withdrawal is not simply a behavioral choice. It is driven by changes in brain function that reduce motivation and increase sensitivity to perceived rejection or negative evaluation. However, this avoidance creates a feedback loop. The less social interaction occurs, the fewer opportunities the brain has to activate these positive neurochemical systems, which can deepen feelings of isolation and low mood. Oxytocin in particular is important because it is associated with trust, bonding, and a sense of connection. Even brief positive social interactions, such as a conversation, a shared activity, or physical touch, can increase oxytocin levels and reduce stress responses. This helps calm the nervous system and counteract the heightened activity in stress-related circuits that is often present in depression. Social interaction also provides external regulation of thought patterns. When left alone, especially in a depressive state, the brain is more likely to default to rumination and negative self-focused thinking. Interaction with others introduces new perspectives, feedback, and emotional cues that can interrupt these internal loops. This does not require deep or intense conversations. Even casual or routine interactions can help shift attention outward and reduce the dominance of negative thoughts. At the same time, structured support such as therapy can play a key role in reshaping the neural patterns associated with depression. Therapeutic approaches, including cognitive behavioral therapy, work by helping individuals identify and modify unhelpful thought patterns and behaviors. This engages the prefrontal cortex, strengthening its ability to regulate emotional responses and override automatic negative thinking. Over time, this leads to changes in how neural circuits are activated and connected. Medication can also be an important component for some individuals, particularly when the biological disruptions are severe. Antidepressant medications often target serotonin and other neurotransmitter systems, helping to stabilize mood and create a more favorable baseline for behavioral and cognitive interventions. While medication does not solve all aspects of depression, it can reduce the intensity of symptoms enough to allow other strategies to be more effective. Another important factor is consistency in social and therapeutic engagement. The brain changes through repeated activation of specific circuits, and regular interaction reinforces the pathways associated with connection, trust, and emotional regulation. Irregular or inconsistent engagement is less effective because it does not provide the repeated input needed to reshape these systems. Depression often narrows the focus inward and reduces interaction with the external world, but social connection and structured support act as counterforces. By reintroducing external input and engaging systems that regulate mood and stress, they help shift the brain away from isolation-driven patterns and toward more adaptive and balanced functioning. Over time, these consistent inputs, connection, therapy, and when needed, medical support, can gradually rebuild the brain's capacity for resilience, making it easier to regulate emotions, break out of negative cycles, and re-engage with life in a more stable and meaningful way.